The rain in Manhattan felt like liquid needles, but it could not wash away the stinging stench of judgment. Amidst the sea of bespoke suits and designer veils, a man of rags stood a ghost in a garden of opulence. When security moved to erase him, the lawyer's voice cut through the silence like a guillotine. The world thought they were witnessing a tragedy. They were actually witnessing a revolution of the soul. The will was about to change everything. Money speaks in whispers, but truth screams in the silence of an empty grave. This is the story of Arthur Sterling, the man who owned the Skyend Iliasta, man who lived beneath the shadows of its skyscrapers. The sky over the Hudson River was a bruised, heavy purple, the color of a fading monarch's final breath. It was a day designed for mourning, yet the air at the Sterling estate felt less like grief and more like a high-stakes board meeting. Arthur Sterling, the man who had reshaped the New York skyline with nothing but iron and ambition, was finally being returned to the earth. The cemetery was a masterpiece of Victorian gloom, where ancient oaks stretched their skeletal fingers toward a sun that refused to shine. Every blade of grass had been manicured to perfection, and even the raindrops seemed to fall with a rhythmic, disciplined precision, as if they were being paid by the hour. The crowd was a curated collection of the world's most influential architects of power. There were senators with silver hair, and even silverer tonguesmen who traded in secrets and legislation. There were supermodels draped in black silk that cost more than a suburban home, their faces frozen in masks of practiced solemnity. They stood in clusters, their breaths forming small ephemeral clouds in the biting autumn air. The scent of expensive cologne, aged scotch, and Lila created a suffocating olfactory wall. It was a symphony of vanity, a final parade for a man who had spent his life surrounded by the finest things money could buy, and people who knew exactly how much everything cost. But the value of nothing. Then, the rhythm of the ritual was shattered. The sound of his approach was the first thing they noticed, a wet, rhythmic slapping of soles against the gravel path. It was a discordant note in a perfectly tuned orchestra. At the edge of the iron gates, a figure emerged from the mist. He did not belong in this world of polished mahogany and silent electric cars. His coat was a patchwork quilt of survival, heavy with the weight of a dozen rainstorms and the grime of the city's underbelly. His beard was a tangled thicket of silver and ash, and his eyes were the color of a winter, sea-deep, turbulent, and hauntingly clear. This was Elias. A collective shiver of disdain rippled through the mourners. It was as if a stain had suddenly appeared on a pristine white tablecloth. The whispers began sharp, jagged needles of judgment. Who was this creature? How had he bypassed the perimeter of black-suited security guards? The atmosphere shifted from somber to predatory. To the elite gathered there, Elias was not a human being. He was a glitch in the system. He was a reminder of the failure they all worked so hard to ignore. Elias moved with a slow, deliberate limp, a souvenir from a war fought in a desert far away, for a country that had long since forgotten his name. Every step seemed to require a monumental effort of will. His hands, gnarled and scarred, clutched the edges of his tattered jacket as if holding on to the last fragments of his own existence. He didn't look at the senators. He didn't look at the cameras. His gaze was fixed entirely on the polished obsidian casket resting at the center of the green expanse. To him, that box didn't contain a billionaire. It contained the only man who had ever looked at him and truly seen a brother. "Excuse me, sir, you've clearly lost your way." The voice was cold, professional, and entirely devoid of empathy. Two security guards, built like granite blocks, stepped into Ilias's path. Their presence was a physical wall of intimidation. They moved with the synchronized grace of predators, their hands hovering near their belts. Elias stopped. He didn't flinch, he didn't retreat. He simply stood his ground, the rain dripping from the tip of his nose, his chest heaving with the exertion of his journey. "I'm here for Arthur," he said. His voice was a low, rumbleless sound, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. It was a voice that hadn't been used for conversation in a long time, but it carried a weight that made the guards pause for a fraction of a second. "This is a private ceremony for family and invited guests only," the taller guard replied, his lip curling in a subtle sneer. "The soup kitchen is 6 blocks downtown. I suggest you start walking before we have to assist you." A ripple of cruel laughter erupted from a group of younger executives nearby. They found the contrast hilarious, the king of industry being mourned by a king of the gutter. They took out their smartphones, ready to capture the moment the trash was taken out. Elias felt the heat of humiliation rising in his neck, a familiar burn he had felt 1,000 times on the streets of Manhattan. He looked down at his boots-cracked leather, held together by sheer luck, and for a moment his resolve wavered. The crushing weight of his poverty felt like a physical chain, pulling him back into the shadows. But then he remembered a cold night in February. He remembered a man in a $5,000 overcoat, sitting on a cardboard box next to him, sharing a thermos of cheap coffee, and talking about the stars. He remembered the way Arthur's hand had felt on his shoulder, firm, warm, and human. "I'm Stian," Elias whispered, more to himself than to the guards. The guards exchanged a glance. The patience was gone. They reached out, their gloved hands grabbing Elias's thin arms, preparing to drag him across the gravel like a sack of refuse. The crowd leaned in, a morbid curiosity flickering in their eyes. They expected a scene. They expected a struggle. They expected the inevitable victory of order over chaos. "Release him immediately." The voice didn't come from the guards. It didn't come from the grieving family. It came from the podium. Marcus Thorne, the most powerful estate lawyer in the tri-state area, man known for his icy demeanor and surgical precision, was standing at the front of the assembly. He wasn't looking at his notes. He was looking directly at Elias. The lawyer's face, usually an unreadable mask of legal stoicism, held something that looked dangerously like reverence. The guards froze. The socialites stopped whispering. The rain seemed to hang suspended in the air. Mr. Thorne, Arthur's eldest son Julian, stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is the meaning of this? Get this vagrant out of here so we can finish the service. It's disgraceful." Thorne didn't even glance at Julian. He walked down the steps of the podium, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the stone path. He approached the 3 men, the 2 giants, and the 1 broken soldier. With a gesture that silenced the entire hillside, he motioned for the guards to step back. "This man," Thorne said, his voice carrying to the very back of the crowd, "is not a vagrant. He is the guest of honor." Elias exhaled a long, shaky breath, a single tear carving a clean path through the dirt on his cheek. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. The world of the elite was about to be dismantled, piece by piece, by a man who didn't even own a pair of dry socks. The silence was not merely an absence of sound, it was a heavy, suffocating presence that settled over the estate like a shroud. Every eye in that prestigious circle was now a camera lens, capturing the impossible image of Marcus Thorne, the gatekeeper of the Sterling Empire, extending a hand to a man who looked like he had been spat out by the very streets. Arthur Sterling had paved. Julian's face underwent a violent transformation, shifting from the composed mask of a grieving heir to a contorted map of disbelief and mounting fury. The veins in his neck throbbed thin, blue lines of aristocratic indignation as he struggled to find words that could bridge the gap between his reality and this unfolding nightmare. He looked at his sisters, Eleanor and Vivian, whose expressions were mirrored echoes of his own, their mouths slightly agape, their eyes darting between the lawyer's stoic face and the ragged intruder. Elias felt the weight of their collective gaze, 1,000 needles of silent accusation. His boots, heavy with the mud of a world they would never inhabit, made a sound like a heartbeat against the gravel. Each step was a choreographed agony, the shrapnel in his knee singing a high, metallic song of protest. But he did not falter. He felt a strange, ethereal warmth radiating from the lawyer's proximity, a sense of protection that was as foreign to him as the scent of the lilies. Thorn's hand remained extended, steady, unwavering, a bridge of mahogany-scented dignity across a canyon of social rot. The wind picked up, whipping the edges of Elias's tattered coat, making the fabric snap like a flag in a storm. He smelled the ozone of the approaching rain and the metallic temps of his own fear butt beneath it all. There was a faint, ghostly scent of expensive tobacco and cedarwood. It was Arthur's scent. "Mr. Thorn, this has gone far enough," Julian hissed, his voice a jagged blade of suppressed rage. He stepped into the path, his chest puffed out, his hands clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. "This is my father's final farewell. If this is some sort of sick, legalistic jokes, my father tucked away in a moment of senility, I will have your license by sunset. Get this animal, away from the casket." The word animal hung in the damp air, brutal, jagged thing that seemed to vibrate with the malice of 1,000 years of class warfare. Thorn did not blink. He didn't even acknowledge Julian's proximity until the younger man was inches from his face. "Mr. Sterling," the lawyer said, his voice as smooth and cold as a sheet of ice. "Your father was many things, but senile was never one of them. He was a man of meticulous foresight. He understood that wealth is a burden that very few have the character to carry." He turned back to Elias, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Please, Elias, take your place at the front. The seat next to the family has been reserved for you for 3 months." The crowd exhaled as one a collective gasp that sounded like the rustle of dead leaves. The seat next to the family, that was the seat of the heir. That was the seat of the confidant. Elias felt the blood rushing in his ears, a dull, rhythmic roar that drowned out the whispers of the elite. He remembered the first time he had seen Arthur, truly seen him. It hadn't been on the news or the cover of a magazine. It had been on a bench in Central Park during the coldest week in January. Arthur had been sitting there, his head in his hands, surrounded by the glittering lights of the city he had built, looking like the loneliest man in the world. Elias had offered him a half-eaten sandwich and a piece of cardboard to sit on. No questions asked, no judgment passed. Just one human being recognizing the hollow ache of another. They had spent 4 hours talking that night. Not about stocks, not about real estate. They talked about the stars, the way the desert smelled after a rainstorm, and the crushing weight of being someone when all you wanted was to be known. Arthur had returned the next week, and the week after that, a billionaire and a veteran, 2 ghosts, haunting the same city, finding a strange, impossible sanctuary in each other's company. Now, as Elias reached the front of the assembly, he saw the obsidian casket. It was beautiful, a dark, reflective mirror that showed him his own reflection. He saw the grime on his forehead, the gray in his beard, but he also saw a dignity he thought he had buried in the sand of a foreign desert. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cold stone. "Goodbye, friend," he whispered. The words were so soft, only Thorn could hear them. The lawyer stepped back up to the podium, his movements deliberate and slow. He produced a leather-bound folder from his briefcase, the clasp clicking open with a sound like a gunshot in the silent cemetery. The papers inside were crisp, white, and heavy, the physical manifestation of a man's final will. The atmosphere was electric, a static charge of tension that made the hair on the back of the mourners' necks stand up. They knew something was coming. They could feel the foundation of their world beginning to crack. "Arthur Sterling," Thorn began, his voice projected by the subtle amplification of the podium, was a man of profound complexity. He knew that his passing would bring out the true nature of those he left behind. "In his final months, he instructed me to oversee a very specific distribution of his estate, one based not on blood, but on the capacity for unsolicited kindness. Julian's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the folder as if it were a poisonous viper. "What are you talking about? The estate is already divided. We've seen the drafts. We've discussed the trusts." "The drafts you saw, Julian, were tests," Thorne replied, his eyes narrowing. "Tests that you and your sisters failed the moment you started arguing over the art collection while your father was still breathing in the hospice wing." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. The lawyer's words were a public flaying, a brutal exposure of the family's greed. Thorne turned a page. The sound of the paper sliding against paper was the only thing heard over the rhythmic drumming of the rain. "To my children," Thorne read, quoting the will, "I leave the properties in Greenwich and the trust funds already established for their maintenance. It is enough to live comfortably, provided they learn the value of work." However, he paused, the silence stretching out. Taut and agonizing, the controlling interest in Sterling International, the Manhattan penthouse, and the remainder of the liquid assets totaling $400 million, to be placed under the sole trusteeship of the man who gave me a sandwich when I was hungry and listened when I was invisible. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Vivian let out a sharp, choked cry before fainting into the arms of a nearby senator. Julian stepped forward, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, but he was blocked by a sudden movement. The two security guards who had tried to drag Elias away only minutes ago now stood in Julian's path, their expressions grim, their loyalty shifted by the inexorable weight of the law. Elias stood there, his hands still resting on the casket. $400 million. The numbers were meaningless to a man who had spent the last decade counting pennies for a cup of coffee. He didn't see the money. He saw the face of a friend who had reached out from beyond the grave to tell him that he mattered. The mystery of why he was here was solved, but the suspense of what would happen next hung over the cemetery like a storm cloud about to burst. He wasn't just a veteran anymore. He was the most powerful man in the room, and the elite were absolutely terrified of what he might do next. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and the metallic temps of an impending social earthquake. Julian Sterling's face was no longer the face of a man. It was a shattered vessel of privilege, leaking a poison that threatened to drown everyone standing on that manicured hillside. He lunged forward, his expensive Italian leather shoes skidding in the darkening mud, his hands outstretched like talons clawing for a phantom crown. "This is a fabrication, an absolute, calculated lie," he screamed, the sound echoing off the marble mausoleums like the cry of a wounded predator. His voice cracked a high, discordant note that betrayed the terror beneath his arrogance. He turned to the crowd, his eyes wild, seeking an ally in the sea of faces that had, only moments ago, bowed to his status. But the elite were shifting. They were already recalculating their loyalties, their gazes turning away from the disgraced heir and toward the man in the tattered coat. The power in the air had migrated, and they could feel its new, erratic pulse. Marcus Thorne stood his ground up, pillar of legal certainty in a landscape of emotional ruin. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses with a slow, deliberate movement that felt like the closing of a heavy iron door. The documents were signed, witnessed, and notarized 3 months ago. "Julian," the lawyer said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 courtroom victories, "your father underwent 3 separate psychiatric evaluations to ensure his testamentary capacity was beyond reproach. He knew you would challenge this. He knew you would call him a madman. And that is exactly why he left a video deposition, currently stored in a secure digital vault, explaining every cent of this decision." Thorne paused, letting the silence expand until it was a physical pressure against the eardrums of the gathered billionaires. Arthur didn't lose his mind. Julian, he finally found his soul, and he realized it was nowhere to be found in the children he had raised. Elias stood motionless, his hands still resting on the cold, obsidian surface of the casket. He felt like a man standing at the center of a hurricane. The world around him was tearing itself apart in a frenzy of greed and shock. Yet he was grounded by the memory of a simple human connection. He remembered the way Arthur's eyes had crinkled when he laughed. A genuine, chest-deep sound that was so rare in the sterile corridors of Sterling International. He remembered Arthur telling him about the crushing weight of being a legacy. The way every person he met saw him as a bank account, rather than a beating heart. Elias hadn't wanted Arthur's money then, and the realization that he possessed it now felt like a heavy, golden yoke being placed around his neck. It was a burden of resilience, a bittersweet gift from a friend who wanted to save one life because he could unsave his own family from their own hollow vanity. You think you can just take it. Julian was inches from Elias now, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and desperation. You think you can walk into our boardrooms with your filth and your rags. You're a ghost, a nothing. We will tie you up in litigation for the next 50 years. You'll be back on your cardboard box before the month is out, starving and forgotten. Elias finally looked up. He didn't look at Julian's expensive tie or his trembling jaw. He looked straight into the man's eyes, the eyes of a soldier who had seen the sun rise over a ruined city, who had felt the breath of death on his neck and chose to keep walking. The intensity of that gaze was enough to make Julian recoil. It wasn't hatred, it was pity, a deep, agonizing pity for a man who had everything and possessed nothing. "I've spent 10 years being invisible, Julian," Elias said, his voice no longer a rumble, but a clear, steady bell that silenced the wind itself. "I've slept in the rain and eaten the scraps from your tables. You can't threaten a man who has already survived the end of his world. Your father didn't give me this money because he wanted me to be like you. He gave it to me because he knew I would use it to find the people you chose to step over." He looked at the crowd, the senators, the models, the magnates stand for the first time in his life. He didn't feel like a pariah. He felt like a judge. This empire will no longer be a monument to one man's greed. It will be a sanctuary for the forgotten. And if you want to fight me in court, bring every lawyer you have. I've lived in the dirt long enough to know how to bury something. The silence that followed was absolute. A vacuum of sound that seemed to pull the very air from the lungs of the mourners. Eleanor and Vivian were weeping now not for their father, but for the loss of the lifestyle they had never earned. The security guards, sensing the definitive shift in the atmosphere, stepped back, clearing a path for the man who was now their employer. Thorne stepped toward Elias, offering a small, encrypted keycard, the physical key to a digital kingdom. "Where to, Mr. Elias?" the lawyer asked, his voice softened by a newfound respect. Elias looked at the keycard, then back at the casket. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper map of the city's most crowded shelters and the darkest alleys where the homeless huddle for warmth. "We're going to the places where the light doesn't reach." "Marcus," Elias said softly, "we have a lot of work to do." He turned and began to walk. He didn't look back at the screaming heirs or the stunned elite. His limp was still there, rhythmic reminder of his past, but his head was held high, his shoulders square. As he reached the iron gates of the estate, the rain finally began to taper off, and a single, defiant ray of sun pierced through the bruised clouds, illuminating the gravel path in front of him. He was no longer a beggar at the gates of power. He was the architect of a new kind of legacy, one built on the foundation of a sandwich shared in the dark and a kindness that refused to be bought. The funeral of Arthur Sterling ended not with a prayer, but with a transformation. The elite climbed into their silent cars, their faces pale and their futures uncertain. They had come to bury a billionaire, but they had witnessed the resurrection of a man's humanity. In the heart of the world's most expensive city, the greatest fortune ever amassed had just been handed to the only man who knew that its true value was zero. Wealth is a fickle, God demands everything and promises nothing. We spend our lives building walls of gold, only to realize they are just gilded cages designed to keep the world out. But Arthur Sterling understood something in his final hours that the rest of his world had forgotten. He understood that the only things we truly take with us are the moments we chose to be human. The moments we reached across the divide of status and held a stranger's hand. Elias walked out of that cemetery with $400 million, but his greatest treasure was the memory of a cold night, a shared thermos, and a friend who saw him when the rest of the world looked away. In the end, we are not defined by the height of the skyscrapers we build, but by the depth of the shadows we choose to light. This is the enduring legacy of Gilded Scraps, where the discarded becomes the divine, and the smallest act of kindness changes the world forever.